this is not AI. If you're a video editor and you're wondering which GPU is best for you, I've got some good news for you because I've spent the last couple of months benchmarking GPUs like crazy. The best and most expensive GPU is not necessarily the best for you. Did you know that certain different softwares also like different types of GPUs? How much VRAM do you actually need? And so much more. This is the ultimate guide for 2026. And these aren't even all the GPUs that I've tested. Deepcool AK700 compact cooling with a smart display. It features 7 advanced copper heat pipes and a next-gen optimized tower delivering unmatched thermal control. I tested it on the Core Ultra 7 265K and it managed to keep it cool down while the CPU pulled over 220 watts of power. The digital screen is a nice touch to easily monitor your computer performance. On the white model, the display through a board effect is a very interesting touch. Perhaps a nice combo with the Gigabyte X870E Aero motherboard. Designed with an offset heat pipes to accommodate the larger heatsink depth for better component compatibility. This allows more space for tall RAM modules. So this is the first part of this video series. Remember last year we did a guide and there was a lot of AMD GPUs missing. That's why I've been re-benchmarking a lot of them, and AMD finally pulled through and we've got some absolutely beautiful AMD GPUs. So in here we have the Sapphire RX 9070 XT Nitro, which I said is one of the most beautiful cards. It's very, very interesting. We're gonna take a look at that in a minute. Then we've got this Sapphire Pure RX 9070 and then a 9060 XT. So we've got different designs, and all of these different designs are basically available in all the GPU configurations as well, if that makes sense. So you can get this white and you can get this nitro and so on. But I want to take a quick second to actually thank you, AMD, for actually providing these so that we can give helpful information to all the creators. They have no input on the video, they just sent the cards. I want to say a huge thank you to Zotac, as you can see over here. That really helps us to provide you helpful information. And then Asus as well. As you can see, we've got some Asus cards in there. By the way, if you want to pick up any of the GPUs, I'm going to leave my links in the video description below. They are affiliate links, which means that if you pick up any of the GPUs, I will get a small commission at no extra cost to you. But that helps us keep this channel going. So thank you very much if you choose to do so. Now, also, if you're a photographer or 3D creator, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, because those videos are coming out, plus an overall all around there. And we're gonna add even more information to each video. So this is the first part of the series. I'm gonna start with the absolute flagship here. This is the Sapphire Nitro 9070 XT, and it's very, very interesting. Firstly, it's an absolute beast, and at the same time, very, very minimalistic. I think this is their like flagship GPU, and it's very, very different, very unified compared to something like this, where it feels like lots of things are going on. The power cables go in there and stuff. Whereas where the power cables go in here, well, you're gonna start to see them on this side. It's got a very special kind of metal cover in the back here, which comes off. And when you take this off, you can see some interesting things. A 12-volt high power cable. Yes, the 16-pin cable that is melting on some of these. And then a RGB out as well, so you can sync the RGB on there with the motherboard. But the cable is completely hidden, so you really don't see it. And I really like to see that, even though this is not one of those Back to the Future or whatever it's called, you know, where you got an extra connector here, you still hide the cable as if there was no cable. There's something about this that feels very, very special. Then we got this Pure card here, which is white, and it is very, very nice. So if you're doing a white build, there is white cards available for this as well. Similar thing, you can sync the ARGB if you want on the side there. But now we've got normal 8-pin PCIe power cables in there. And then we've got this Pulse one, which is more simplified, more affordable version in terms of the design and, you know, the lower end. So you can kind of have a feel of all of these different AMD cards right over there. My test bench setup, what am I using? I am using Intel 12900K, and very importantly, I haven't got the iGPU enabled. So the CPU is not giving any benefits to any of the other ones. So we are actually testing the card's media engines, which you'll learn more about in a minute, but there's no iGPU on just the cards, which is different from CPU testing when we're testing CPUs. We're using 64 gigabytes of DDR4 3600 megahertz RAM. We're using Samsung 980 Pro SSD for our SSD, 360mm AIO from Arctic, the Freezer 2, the previous version, and 1200 watt Be Quiet power supply. If you want to check any of those out, I'm going to leave the link in the description below. Media engines inside these GPUs. This is something that you don't see gamers talk about or in the gaming reviews, but media engines for creators, arguably one of the most important things that you can actually come across. And why is that? Well, the media engines are different from any other part of the GPU. You've got some like RT cores, you've got some CUDA cores, or other shader units, what AMD calls. And then there's media engines. They're probably the smallest part in the GPU, but those media engines give you hardware acceleration playback on certain video codecs. And they're completely different from NVIDIA to AMD to Intel, and different generations of GPUs will have different encoders, and they make a huge difference. This is where the 50 series made the biggest leap for video editors, because if you look at the 3D rendering performance, spoiler alert, that's coming out, there's not that much of a difference between 50 and 40 series, but in video editing, certain workflows, huge difference. So then, talking about these AMD media engines, apparently those 9000 series have 2 media engines inside. In terms of codec support, it's actually quite poor. They don't support 10-bit photo 2 like we can see on NVIDIA or Intel media engines, so that's not so impressive. But at the same time, H.264 codec playback or long GOP actual encoding, they are very, very fast. But there's a little bit of an asterisk where we have to talk about encoding quality. Now, you might be hearing me talk about encoding and decoding. If you're new here, let me explain what that means. Encoding means putting video together. So let's say you've got your video timeline and then you want to export it out. That means now you're encoding video. You're putting the video, making it into a different format. Decoding video, like decoding or decrypting, algorithm, you have to decode or playing that video back, because the video has been recorded with certain compression rate and certain file, but now you have to decode that what's been written, and then that's video playback decoding. Very, very different, and different media engines support different things. For you as a video editor, there's a huge difference between a timeline playback and exporting video. So sometimes if someone just shows you benchmark of, yeah, this exports video faster than the other one, that is not really the full actual performance review of what this codec can do, because I would argue that timeline playback is a lot more important than actual exporting speed. Because if you're editing on the timeline, you need it to be snappy, you want it to be fast when you're working with it, because you can actually go and make a cup of coffee or tea when you're exporting the video, whereas you can't do that when you're editing the video. So very different and very important depending on your workflow. So there's hardware and software playback. When the hardware on the GPU media engines can play back the codec, whether encoding or decoding, that's what we call hardware acceleration. There's special hardware inside those devices that can accelerate it and make it very, very fast. If it's software playback, what happens then with decoding or exporting, for example, or playback, is now your CPU cores, the cores that calculate everything else in your PC, they will take over and they try to play back this footage. Now, if you're an AMD Threadripper, for example, try playing back H.265 10-bit 422 footage, press play, and then you'll see all of your cores suddenly pump up, and then it's just horrendous. Sometimes the RTX 5050 that's over here, that can play back footage a lot faster than AMD 96-core Threadripper, just because it's got hardware, little tiny thing that only takes a couple of watts, compared to hard Threadripper that pulls 350 watts, is not going to do as good of a job as this 5050. That's the magic of having hardware accelerated playback. But it depends which codec you're using, because not every single codec is hardware accelerated. There's a huge codec difference between different codec and what you're using. If you're using Blackmagic RAW cinema cameras, Red RAW, Sony RAW, H.264 and 5 codecs, there's a huge difference. Or ProRes, actually, there's different codecs. Now, if you're wondering what the difference is between long GOP, interframe, and then RAW codecs, then I've got a video I'm gonna link in the description below just to keep this a little bit shorter, where I'll go in depth about explaining this if that is new to you. But very importantly, what you need to know is that the codec has a much bigger impact on performance than the resolution. Sometimes people say, yeah, it can playback or edit 8K footage. And I would argue, I can give you 1080p footage that it would struggle, but then 8K footage that would be very, very smooth, just because you've got hardware acceleration for that specific codec. So codec is more important than resolution, and not everything is hardware accelerated. Okay then, let's move on to Premiere Pro, and what you can see over here is a huge set of numbers and going in depth. And as you can see, there's long GOP standard, interframe standard, RAW standard, and GPU effects standard, and then extended effects. They're completely different codecs, different types of things, what we're playing back. But here you can see a huge difference. And as you can see from these charts, I've got more than just these GPUs that we have in here. I have tested finally the latest AMD ones, which we're really gonna see how good is the latest AMD GPUs for video editing. And then previous generation AMD, and then previous generation Intel and Nvidia as well. Another very important note before diving into these benchmarks, this specific version of Premiere Pro and Future Bench that I'm using does not support 10-bit H.264 and 5 422 playback on the 50 series GPUs. So here you're not gonna see the huge jump ahead of the 50 series GPUs when you're playing back the H.264 10-bit 422, for example. Previously, this was only available on software playback, so CPU was playing this back, but now the 50 series can do that, but this benchmark does not show that. Why? Adobe actually removed the ability to playback H.265 on third-party plugins and so on, so you can't really test that on Future Bench. The newer version does test a little bit different things, but we're still not going to see the actual benefit of this. So in here, that does not support that. So know that if you go in with the 50 series, you're going to get extra boost or extra performance if you're editing H.264 and 5 10-bit 422 footage, because these allow more codec support than any of the other Intel or AMD GPUs. So if we're looking at the 4080 Super here and the 5090, for example, it looks like there's only 7% difference in terms of overall scores. Well, the 50 series actually has more increased performance just because of this. But regardless, we're still gonna find out which one is better. Another thing to mention is that Premiere Pro loves a lot of CPU power and RAM usage, not as much VRAM, whereas DaVinci Resolve loves more VRAM and then less RAM, if that makes sense. Also very important to mention. So if we're looking at the bottom, the RTX A1000, then you can see that roughly between that one and then the 5090, we have double of the performance in here. But not everything is the same, because if you're looking at this part over here, you can see that long GOP is not all equal. You can see that this one over here, the Asus Radeon AI Pro R9700, has got very high long GOP score. Actually, a lot better than actually Nvidia, just because partly Nvidia is not supported in there, but it also does a very, very good job. The 9070, again, very, very high score in there for that one. But I'm gonna leave this one over here for you to dive deeper into. Depending which codecs you're using, you might get different results. So as you can see, the 9070 XT compared to a 5060, for example, look at the difference in raw scores. You might be using raw and you're saying, actually, I might go with the 5060, depending which resolution raw you're using. We're gonna talk about VRAM requirements in a minute. If we're looking at the standard overall scores here for Premiere Pro, I've tried to do a little bit of a color grading that's a little bit different, so that you actually see what's the difference between different generations of GPUs. So the dark green is the 50 series. The non-colored ones are the last generation AMD and last generation of Nvidia, as well as some of the Pro cards from Intel and AMD. So firstly, one of the main things to notice here is that 5090 is on top of the chart, and that is probably given. But what's interesting here is compared to the 5090 and 4090, there is not that big of a difference. In fact, extended overall scores looks to be a little bit higher on the 4090 compared to the 5090. And here you can see that because of the codec difference and so on, there's not that big of a jump between 40 and 50 series, just because we can't really see the codec utilization on H.264 and 5 on the 50 series. Another interesting thing to mention over here is that the 7900 XT is slightly better than the 3090 TUF in my testing in here. For weird reason that is happening. I don't know why, it shouldn't really, but that's the truth. The AMD last generation card is better than the 3090. Also, if we're looking at this bit over here, which is the best AMD card that AMD offers for us at the moment, we can see that that's not particularly impressive. It's only marginally better than the Zotac or NVIDIA RTX 5060. So the best of AMD, this guy here, is only just about better than the 5060, which we have right on the top there. So for video editing, not particularly impressive from AMD's side. Also, a little bit of a disappointment from AMD's Pro card in here for video editing. Overall scores, but remember, not everything is here depending what codec you're doing. Not very, very impressive. Intel here is on the lower side here with the Arc A770, but that is roughly around the $300 card. That being said, pretty impressive for H.264 and 5 codecs and overall video editing codec if you're looking at on Intel side. I've got the 3070 here as well, just for reference, in case you want to check that one out, how that might perform. And the overall scores there, you can find that in there. Now moving on to After Effects, and even though our GPU here is not the most important, there is some things that are still accelerated on the GPU on After Effects. So bear that in mind if you have a lot of VRAM and some of the GPU accelerated effects. GPUs will give you the boost in After Effects. So here you can see the overall scores and really the numbers and how everything lines up. Sometimes the Intel cards, for example, if you're looking at this point, it didn't complete the extended overall score, so we just got a standard score. So it's kind of marked on the standard scores in here, but then these percentages are calculated over the extended, if that makes sense. So we can see that from the extended to the 7600 dual, we've got about 40%, 45% difference. So the 7600 is about 45% slower compared to the 5090, which we have on the top just over there. Between 5090 and 4090, here we're seeing roughly around 6% difference. So if you don't need the VRAM increase, perhaps going with the 4090 actually makes a ton of sense. The different scores here, 2D, 3D, and tracking standard and extended scores, dive deeper into it depending what your workflow is on After Effects there. But then visually looking at the difference, what's going on in there. Looking at the AMD cards, they're right on the bottom here, which is a bit of a disappointment. Even the Intel Arc B580, I don't know why the font's gone so weird so you can't really see, but this card there is performing better than the AMD cards. It's not particularly impressive from AMD's side. In fact, the last generation 7900 XTX is performing better than the newer ones. That at the same time, well, for what you're paying for this card, you can get a 4060 that performs quite a bit better. So there's a huge gap just around here. As you can see, the 4060 and A1000 is lower. There's a huge jump between those two and then slightly growing up this way. Now moving on to DaVinci Resolve, and here's where we see a huge difference and we can really take utilization of all of the 50 series. So DaVinci Resolve has done the best in terms of utilizing this, and we really see all of the cards shine as well as possible. In fact, AMD is doing very, very well for DaVinci Resolve. So if you're editing in DaVinci Resolve, there is not that bad news what we saw from Adobe before. Obviously, the best card again is the 5090, which is performing very, very well. And between 5090 and 5080, there is roughly around 11% difference. So quite a big jump for 5090, more VRAM, much more powerful, very, very good. And you can see that in the AI scores in there, for example. You can also here see how good the long GOP score is for the 50 series. We're really seeing a boost in there compared to the 40 series, which we can see over there. We're getting almost double the long GOP scores, and that's really the benefit of the new encoders and media engines inside the 50 series. Very, very impressive there. But now, at the same time, what you can see in there is the Asus Radeon Pro R9700, and the long GOP score also very, very impressive. And so is the 9070 XT. As you can see, the new media engines on the AMD cards are doing very, very well. Only 25% lower than the 5090, the AMD Pro card, but less than half of the price. So perhaps if you're wanting to do any editing in there and wanting to save, then the AMD cards are actually not doing that bad at all. Very, very impressive. Depending obviously what you're doing, but for example, RAW is a lot better on the 50 series compared to the AMD series, 5070 performing roughly about the same as the AMD Radeon. But you can see that if you're doing any AI like mask detection or subject detection or tracking on DaVinci Resolve, you can see how the NVIDIA cards are quite a bit better than the best of AMD is pretty much halfway down. 4090 and 5090, very, very similar performance actually in terms of AI, but going from 4090 to 5090, the overall score is only about 18% slower on the 4090. So depending where you can get the card and what you can get, if you're not doing long GOP scores, I would probably recommend going with 40 series, but if you're doing H.264 and 5, the 50 series really gives you a boost in there. And you can see how these 50 series have a huge jump in this point in standard and extended overall scores, which is pretty insane. Now, here you can see that the AMD cards are very competitive. The 9070 XT, 9070, and then even the Pro cards there, all of this here is AMD. The sad bit is that they're kind of performing very, very similar. That being said, the 9070 XT is actually better than the 4090 according to my testing, which is quite impressive for DaVinci Resolve. Now, since the 30 series, we've seen quite a big jump, and then Intel is not very impressive in DaVinci Resolve, just probably not utilized, even though it does have large amounts of VRAM. Regardless, I think AMD is not bad. Ultimate cards, obviously from NVIDIA. And then on the budget and lower end, perhaps even going with the Sapphire 9060 XT, which is not performing that bad in there. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is VRAM capacity. How much VRAM do you need as a video editor? Here's my guide, what I would say. 8 GB for basic 4K editing and 1080p. If you're going more complex 4K and starting to do some multicam editing, for example, then 12 GB. If you go in 4K complex editing, I would say 16 GB plus, and then if there's 4K multicam editing, 16 GB plus. If you're doing multiple 4Ks, complex 4K, 6K and above, I would say 24 GB and above. Just for reference, what we're doing here is Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera, 6K in there, 4K from Sony, 4K over there. So 3 cameras in multicam, we're editing, that's like the main timeline, plus B-roll on top, plus FX, plus other things on top. We can see 20, 21 GB of VRAM sometimes used. So hopefully that puts you in the perspective. But at the same time, maybe if you're doing wedding editing or event editing, it's not very likely that you have multiple cameras on top of each other. There's single cameras playing it back. You just swap to a different camera or cut to a different camera that's different than having this type of editing what we have here. So if it's 6K and above, I would say that you're kind of locked now to the 4090 or 5090, the 90 series cards to get more VRAM. Now, hopefully this was helpful for you. If you have any other questions, leave them below. Check out the description if you want to pick up any of these cards. Again, thank you everybody for watching. Let me know what you guys think. If you have any other questions, maybe we can get them answered on the short form or on the future videos in this series. Thank you very much guys for watching, and keep creating those videos, and hopefully we'll see you very soon. And to remind you, if you don't know the difference in codecs, go check out this video just over here. Thank you. Bye-bye.